No mother should have to dig through trash to find Christmas gifts for her child. But on this bitter December night in rural Pennsylvania, that's exactly what Maren was doing behind Miller's General Store. Eli Fisher, a 63-year-old Amish widower, watched from his workshop doorway as the young woman searched desperately through discarded boxes. Her thin coat offered little protection against the wind, and her careful movements spoke of practiced survival. Something about her desperation reminded Eli of his own losses. He had buried his wife Sarah 3 winters ago, and the loneliness still cut deep. When he offered the stranger shelter in his workshop, he expected nothing more than to help a neighbor in need. But when she stepped into the lamplight, he saw the silver locket around her neck. The same locket he had given to another woman 40 years ago, before he chose his plain life over love. What secret was this young mother carrying, and how would it change everything Eli thought he knew about his past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost on Eli Fisher's workshop window told the story of another sleepless night. He had been awake since 3 in the morning, his calloused hands shaping a piece of maple wood into what would become a child's rocking horse. The rhythmic sound of his plane against the grain had become his meditation, the only thing that quieted the echoes in his mind. Sarah's wedding quilt still covered their bed upstairs in the farmhouse, though he hadn't slept there since the funeral. The quilt bore witness to 40 years of marriage, every stitch a prayer, every pattern a memory of their life together. She had worked on it during their engagement, her fingers dancing across the fabric with the same gentle precision she brought to everything in their life. Now it lay undisturbed, too sacred to remove, yet too painful to face each night. The Amish community of Cedar Valley had watched Eli retreat into his work these past 3 years. His furniture had always been sought after, chairs that would last generations, tables that bore the weight of family meals and difficult conversations, cradles that welcomed new life into the world. But since Sarah's passing, his pieces had taken on an almost desperate perfection, as if he could carve away his grief with each careful stroke of his tools. Bishop Samuel Yoder had spoken to him about remarriage. At 63, Eli was still strong, still capable of providing for a family. There were widows in the community who would welcome his companionship, women who understood the rhythms of plain life and could help him find his way back to contentment. But Eli's heart remained closed to such possibilities. Sarah had been his anchor, his compass, his reason for choosing this life over the English world he had once known. The workshop door creaked as the December wind found its way through gaps in the weathered wood. Eli set down his plane and moved to the window, wiping away the condensation with his shirt sleeve. The general store across the lane showed only a single light in the back room, where old Heinrich Miller counted the day's receipts. The rest of Cedar Valley slept peacefully under a blanket of fresh snow, secure in their faith and their community. It was then that Eli saw her. The figure moved like a shadow behind Miller's store, hunched against the cold and moving with the careful stealth of someone who didn't want to be noticed. At first he thought it might be one of the teenagers from the community, perhaps sneaking out for some harmless mischief. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized this was a woman, young, desperate, and very much alone. She wore clothes that marked her as English, a thin jacket that provided little protection against the bitter night, jeans worn thin at the knees, boots that had seen better seasons. Her dark hair escaped from beneath a knitted cap as she bent over the trash bin behind the store, her movements careful and methodical. She wasn't vandalizing or stealing. She was searching through discarded items with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to find treasure in what others threw away. Eli's chest tightened as he watched her pull out a small object, examine it in the dim light from the street lamp, then tuck it carefully into her jacket pocket. This was no teenage prank. This was survival. 30 miles away, in a motel room that smelled of cigarettes and broken dreams, 6-year-old Tommy Peterson slept fitfully on a bed that had seen too many temporary residents. His small body was curled around a stuffed rabbit that had lost most of its fur, a gift from better times when his mother could afford new toys and his father was still alive. Maren Peterson sat in the room's only chair, staring at the notice of eviction that had arrived that morning. 3 days. Until checkout, and then what? The last of their money had gone to keeping the room through Christmas Eve. She had applied for every job within 50 miles, waitressing, cleaning, retail work during the holiday rush. But without a permanent address, without reliable childcare, without the luxury of professional clothes for interviews, the doors kept closing in her face. She thought about her mother, Rebecca, who had died when Maren was just 19. Rebecca had never spoken much about Maren's father, only that he had been a good man who couldn't choose between two different worlds. Some people are meant for different paths, Rebecca used to say, fingering the silver locket she always wore. That doesn't make either path wrong. The locket had been Rebecca's most treasured possession, and now it hung around Maren's neck, the only connection to a past she had never fully understood. After Rebecca's death, Maren had tried to trace her father's identity, but the trail led nowhere. Rebecca had taken her secrets to the grave, leaving behind only questions and a daughter who struggled to find her place in a world that seemed determined to push her to the margins. Maren's late husband, David, had been her anchor. For 5 years, he had loved Tommy as his own son, had built them a small but happy life in Ohio. His death in a factory accident 2 years ago had shattered everything. The insurance money hadn't lasted long, and without David's steady income, the bills had mounted faster than Maren could pay them. They had moved from apartment to apartment, each one smaller and cheaper than the last, until finally there were no more apartments they could afford. The bus ticket to Pennsylvania had been a desperate gamble. Maren had heard about seasonal work in the rural communities, farms that needed temporary help, stores that hired extra workers for the holidays. She had thought that in a smaller town, away from the expensive cities, she might find a foothold for herself and Tommy. Instead, she had found only more closed doors and suspicious looks. The few jobs available had gone to locals or to people with references she couldn't provide. The motel manager had already hinted that they would need to move on soon, and tomorrow was Christmas Eve. Maren looked at her sleeping son and made a silent promise. Whatever it took, Tommy would have something to open on Christmas morning. Even if she had to search through every trash bin in Cedar Valley, she would find something to put a smile on his face. Back at the general store, Eli watched the young woman's systematic search with growing concern. She moved with purpose, but also with the careful awareness of someone who knew she didn't belong here. When she found what appeared to be a small toy truck among the discarded items, her shoulders sagged with relief. She held it up to the light, examining it for damage, then pressed it to her chest as if it were made of gold. That simple gesture broke something open in Eli's chest. He recognized the fierce protectiveness of a parent, the desperate love that would search through garbage to find a moment of joy for a child. Sarah had never been able to have children, and the absence of young voices in their home had been a quiet sorrow they had carried together. But he remembered how she had loved the children in their community, how her face had lit up whenever a neighbor brought a baby to visit. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around the young woman's feet. She pulled her thin jacket tighter and prepared to leave, clutching her small treasure. But as she turned toward the street, the wind caught her hood and pushed it back from her face. In that moment, under the pale glow of the streetlight, Eli saw her clearly for the first time. She was younger than he had thought, probably not yet 30, with delicate features marked by exhaustion and worry. But it wasn't her face that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the locket, even. From a distance, even after 40 years, Eli recognized the distinctive silver oval that caught the light as it swayed against her chest. His hands began to tremble as memories flooded back. Memories he had carefully buried beneath decades of faithful marriage and devoted service to his community. Rebecca. The locket had belonged to Rebecca Hartwell, the English girl who had worked summers at her uncle's farm just outside Cedar Valley. Eli had been 23 then, still in his Rumspringa, still torn between the plain life his family expected and the wider world that beckoned beyond the boundaries of their community. He had loved her with the intensity that only young hearts can sustain. They had met in secret, walking through meadows under starlit skies, sharing dreams of a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. The locket had been his gift to her on her 20th birthday, a simple silver oval that opened to reveal their photograph together, young and hopeful and certain that love could overcome any obstacle. But love, as Eli had learned, was not always enough to bridge the gap between different worlds. The young woman turned and walked away into the night, disappearing into the shadows between the buildings. But the image of that locket burned in Eli's mind, raising questions he had thought buried forever. He stood at his workshop window for a long time after she was gone, his reflection staring back from the frost-covered glass. The maple wood sat, unfinished on his workbench, the rocking horse taking shape slowly, patiently, like all good things in life. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in the wind outside. Some people come into our lives for a reason, Eli. Don't let fear keep you from recognizing grace when it appears. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find out who this young woman was and why she carried Rebecca's locket. Tomorrow, he would discover what threads of the past had woven themselves into this cold Christmas Eve in Cedar Valley. But tonight, he would simply pray for her safety and for the wisdom to know what God was calling him to do. The next morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made even the hardiest souls question the wisdom of leaving their warm beds. Eli had managed only 2 hours of sleep, his mind churning with memories and questions that refused to settle. He stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun struggle to pierce the grey December sky, when he saw her again. She was walking down the main road with a small boy beside her, both of them bundled in clothes too thin for the weather. The child skipped occasionally despite the cold, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. His mother, for there was no doubt this was the woman from last night, walked with the measured pace of someone conserving energy, her hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. They stopped at Miller's General Store, the woman counting coins in her palm before pushing through the heavy door. Through the frosted window, Eli could see her purchasing what appeared to be milk and bread, the basics of survival, nothing more. Tommy Peterson pressed his nose against the store's window display, marveling at the mechanical Santa that waved from behind dusty glass. At 6 years old, he still believed in magic, still trusted that Christmas morning would bring wonder despite the uncertainty that had defined his recent months. His mother had promised him that this Christmas would be different, special in ways he couldn't yet understand. "Mama, look at the train," he whispered, pointing to a model railroad that circled beneath a miniature Christmas tree. "It goes around and around." Maren followed his gaze, her heart constricting at the simple joy in his voice. The toy train set probably cost more than she had spent on food in the past month, but she smiled and nodded, storing away his excitement for later, when she would have to explain why some dreams had to wait. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she murmured, gathering their meager purchases. "Maybe we can watch it again tomorrow." As they prepared to leave the store, Heinrich Miller cleared his throat behind the counter. The elderly man had run the general store for 40 years, had seen countless families struggle through hard times, but something about this young woman and her son had touched his practical heart. "Excuse me, miss," he said in his careful English, still colored by the German of his childhood. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you new to Cedar Valley?" Maren stiffened slightly, her protective instincts flaring. But she saw only kindness. In the old man's eyes, the same gentle curiosity she remembered from her mother's descriptions of rural communities. "We're just passing through," she replied carefully, "looking for work, maybe staying a few days." Heinrich nodded slowly. "There's not much work this time of year," he admitted. "Most folks are hunkering down for winter. But if you need a place to stay warm, the community center has a heating room. They don't mind if people rest there during the day." "Thank you," Maren said, genuine gratitude warming her voice. "That's very kind." As they stepped back into the brutal cold, Tommy tugged on his mother's coat. "Mama, I'm hungry." The words hit Maren like a physical blow. The bread and milk would have to last them until evening, maybe longer. But looking down at her son's trusting face, she made an impulsive decision. "Let's find somewhere warm to have." "A breakfast," she said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. They were halfway across the lane when Eli Fisher emerged from his workshop. He had been watching for them, had spent the morning rehearsing what he might say to the young woman who wore Rebecca's locket. But now, faced with the reality of approaching a stranger, an English stranger, his carefully planned words deserted him. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying across the cold air. Maren turned, immediately on guard. She had learned to be wary of men who approached her and Tommy when they were alone. But this man appeared harmless enough, tall and lean, with graying hair beneath his black hat and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His plain clothes marked him as Amish, and his weathered hands suggested a lifetime of honest work. "Yes," she replied, keeping Tommy close to her side. Eli stopped a respectful distance away, suddenly unsure how to bridge the gap between his careful community and this desperate young family. "I saw you last night," he said gently, "behind the store. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Color flooded Maren's cheeks. She had been so careful, had thought no one was watching. The shame of being seen searching through trash threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "We're fine," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Tommy looked up at the tall stranger with open curiosity. "Are you a farmer?" he asked, unaware of the tension between the adults. A smile tugged at the corners of Eli's mouth. "I am a furniture maker," he replied. "I build chairs and tables and toys." "Real toys?" Tommy's eyes widened with interest. "Tommy," Maren warned softly, but Eli held up a gentle hand. "It's all right," he assured her. Then to Tommy, "Yes, real toys. Would you like to see my workshop?" The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond. A simple invitation. Maren's first instinct was to decline, to gather Tommy and hurry away from this complication. But the cold was seeping through their inadequate clothes, and she could feel her son beginning to shiver despite his excitement. "We wouldn't want to impose," she said carefully. "It would be no imposition," Eli replied, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a depth to his kindness that suggested personal understanding of loss and struggle. "The workshop is warm, and I have coffee, good coffee." Tommy was already pulling toward the workshop, drawn by the promise of warmth and the mysterious world of toy-making. Maren found herself nodding before she had fully made the decision. Just for a few minutes, she agreed, to warm up. The workshop was a revelation of order and beauty. Hand tools hung in precise arrangements on wooden pegboards, and the air carried the rich scents of oak, maple, and cedar. A pot-bellied stove radiated blessed warmth, and several pieces of furniture in various stages of completion testified to the craftsman's skill. Tommy immediately gravitated toward a partially carved rocking horse, his small hands reaching out to touch the smooth wood before catching himself and looking up at Eli for permission. "You may touch it," Eli said softly. "It's meant to be touched, to be used. A toy that can't be played with is no toy at all." As Tommy explored the workshop with the wonder of childhood, Eli poured coffee from a pot that had been warming on the stove. He handed a cup to Maren, noting how her cold fingers wrapped around the warmth gratefully. "I'm Eli Fisher," he said simply, Maren Peterson, she replied after a moment's hesitation. And this is Tommy. The coffee was indeed good, rich and strong, and exactly what she needed to chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. For a few minutes, they stood in comfortable silence, watching Tommy discover the magic of the workshop. It was then that Eli caught sight of the locket again, clearer now in the lamplight of his workshop. The silver oval rested against Maren's collarbone, and when she leaned forward to call Tommy away from a sharp chisel, it swung free of her jacket. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. There, engraved in delicate script on the face of the locket, were the initials EF and RH, Eli Fisher and Rebecca Hartwell. The very locket he had saved for months to buy had presented to Rebecca with trembling hands on a summer evening 40 years ago. "Your locket," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maren's hand flew to her throat, her fingers closing protectively around the silver oval. "It was my mother's," she said, suddenly defensive. "Your mother," Eli repeated slowly, his mind reeling with implications. What was her name? Something in his tone made Maren study his face more carefully. She saw recognition there, and something deeper, a pain that matched her own understanding of loss. "Rebecca," she said quietly. "Rebecca Hartwell." The coffee cup slipped from Eli's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the workshop floor. But neither of them noticed the spreading puddle or Tommy's startled exclamation. They were staring at each other across 40 years of separation, across two different worlds, across a gulf that had just revealed itself to be far narrower than either had imagined. "Rebecca," Eli whispered, and in that single word lay a lifetime of what-ifs and might-have-beens. The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was certain they should cross. Tommy, oblivious to the weight of the moment, had discovered a box of wood shavings and was building small mountains with the curled strips. His quiet contentment, a stark contrast to the tension filling the workshop. Eli knelt to clean up the broken coffee cup, his hands shaking slightly as he gathered the pieces. 40 years of careful control, of buried memories and accepted loss, had just shattered as completely as the ceramic at his feet. "Rebecca Hartwell," he repeated, as if testing the name against his tongue after decades of silence. She would be your mother." Maren watched him carefully, noting how his weathered hands trembled as he worked. "She died 7 years ago," she said softly. "Cancer. She never talked much about Pennsylvania, but she kept that locket until the day she passed." Eli's shoulders sagged as he absorbed this news. Rebecca was gone, had been gone for years, and he had never known. All the times he had wondered what became of her, had caught himself listening for news from the English world. She had already been beyond his reach. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the formal words inadequate for the storm of grief and regret threatening to overwhelm him. Rebecca was a remarkable woman." "You knew her well?" Maren asked, though something in his manner suggested. The answer went far deeper than casual acquaintance. Eli stood slowly, the broken pieces of cup cradled in his palm like fragments of memory. "We were young," he said simply. "It was a long time ago, but even as he spoke, his mind was traveling back to that distant summer when Rebecca Hartwell had come to stay with her uncle on the farm adjoining the Fisher property. She had been 20, fresh from college in Philadelphia, full of ideas about the world that extended far beyond the rolling hills of Cedar Valley. Eli had been 23, caught in the uncertain space of Rumspringa, still trying to choose between the life his family expected and the wider world that called to his restless heart. Their first meeting had been awkward, Rebecca struggling with her uncle's temperamental tractor while Eli watched from across the fence line. Pride and propriety had warred with compassion until finally he had offered to help, climbing over the fence to examine the stubborn engine. "Thank you," she had said, wiping grease from her hands with a cloth that only spread the stain further. "Uncle Henry insists I can handle farm work, but I think the machinery knows I'm a fraud." Eli had smiled despite himself. "Machines don't care about fraud," he had replied in his careful English, still self-conscious about his accent. They only care about understanding. That simple exchange had been the beginning of everything. Now, watching Maren's face as she waited for him to continue, Eli saw echoes of Rebecca in the curve of her cheek, the stubborn tilt of her chin when she was uncertain. But where Rebecca had carried herself with the confidence of someone who had always belonged somewhere, Maren bore the careful posture of someone who had learned not to expect welcome. "She never mentioned you," Maren said, and Eli heard both question and accusation in her voice. "She wouldn't have," Eli replied. "It would have served no purpose." In the old wooden chest beneath his workbench, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath his carpentry plans, lay Rebecca's letters. 17 letters written over the course of that magical summer, filled with her thoughts about faith and freedom, about the possibility of building bridges between different worlds. He had kept everyone, though he hadn't looked at them since. His wedding day to Sarah. The letters told a story of two young people trying to negotiate the impossible, a love that crossed not just religious boundaries, but entire ways of life. Rebecca had been willing to try, had even attended several Sunday services at the Amish church, learning the hymns and sitting quietly through sermons delivered in German she didn't understand. But Eli's family had made their position clear. His father, stern and uncompromising, had spoken of the dangers of marrying outside the faith. The bishop had counseled patience, suggesting that perhaps Rebecca might convert, might find her place among the plain people. But even as they spoke of possibilities, Eli had seen the doubt in their eyes, the certainty that this English girl with her college education and worldly ideas would never truly belong. The breaking point had come in August, just before Rebecca was to return to Philadelphia. Eli's baptism had been scheduled for the following spring, the final commitment that would seal his place in the Amish community forever. But accepting baptism while married to an English woman would be impossible. The choice had been stark. Rebecca or his family, his community, his faith. "Did you love her?" Maren asked suddenly, and the directness of the question cut through his careful reminiscing. Tommy looked up from his wood shavings at the serious tone in his mother's voice, his 6-year-old instincts telling him that something important was happening. He abandoned his play and came to stand beside Maren, his small hands slipping into hers. Eli met Maren's gaze steadily, seeing no point in dishonesty after 40 years of carrying the truth alone. "Yes," he said simply, "I loved her very much. But you didn't choose her." "No, I didn't choose her." The words hung between them, heavy, with the weight of roads not taken and lives that might have been lived differently. Eli had chosen duty over desire, community over individual happiness, the known path over the uncertain adventure that loving Rebecca would have required. He had married Sarah 2 years later, and it had been a good marriage, built on mutual respect, shared faith, and genuine affection that had deepened into love over 4 decades. Sarah had never asked about his past, had accepted his occasional silences and distant looks as part of the man she chose to spend her life with. She had been everything a good Amish wife should be: faithful, hard-working, content with the plain life they built together. But on quiet nights, especially after Sarah's death, Eli had sometimes wondered what might have happened if he had been brave enough to choose differently. Would he and Rebecca have found a way to make it work? Would they have built a life together somewhere between his world and hers? Now, looking at Maren, Rebecca's daughter, he was confronted with at least a partial answer to those questions. Rebecca had found love elsewhere, had built a family, had lived a full life without him. The thought brought both relief and a sharp stab of something that might have been jealousy. "She married someone else," Maren said, as if reading his thoughts. "My stepfather James, he was a good man, raised me as his own. But she always kept that locket, always kept your initials close to her heart." The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. After all these years, after building a life with another man, Rebecca had still carried some piece of what they had shared. The knowledge was both blessing and curse, proof that their love had been real, had mattered, but also a reminder of what they had both given up. Tommy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, I'm still hungry," he whispered. The simple words broke through the emotional haze surrounding the adults, reminding them that regardless of the past's claims on their hearts, the present still demanded attention. Maren looked down at her son, then back at Eli with visible uncertainty. "We should go," she said. "We've imposed on your kindness long enough." But the thought of them leaving, of losing this unexpected connection to Rebecca's life, filled Eli with something close to panic. "Please," he said, the word coming out more urgently than he had intended. "Stay a while longer. Let me make you something to eat." Maren hesitated, her practical instincts warring with the strange pull she felt toward this gentle man who had known her mother in ways she was only beginning to understand. Tommy's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and the decision was made for her. "If it's no trouble," she said quietly. Eli's relief was palpable. "No trouble at all. The house is just across the yard." As they walked through the crisp morning air toward the white farmhouse that had been Eli's home for 4 decades, he found himself seeing it through English eyes for the first time in years. The simple lines, the absence of decorative elements that his community viewed as prideful, the functional beauty that spoke of generations of plain living. "It's lovely," Maren said, and she meant it. The house possessed a serene quality that spoke of peace and permanence, things that had been missing from her life for so long that she had almost forgotten what they looked like. Tommy ran ahead to examine the wooden porch swing, his eyes bright with the simple pleasure of discovering something new. "Can I swing on it?" he asked. "Of course," Eli replied, watching as the boy climbed up and began to push himself gently back and forth. "That swing has held many children over the years." But even as he spoke, Eli felt the familiar pang of loss. He and Sarah had built that swing with their own children in mind, had imagined little ones playing on it while they watched from the kitchen window. That dream had never materialized, and the swing had remained empty, except for the occasional visiting child from their community. Inside the house, Maren was struck by the simplicity and order of everything. The kitchen was spotless, with well-worn, but carefully maintained appliances and furniture that spoke of quality craftsmanship. But there was something missing, a sense of life being fully lived rather than simply endured. Eli's baptism certificate hung in a simple frame near the kitchen table, the German script marking his formal entry into the Amish faith, 41. Years ago, Maren studied it while he prepared breakfast, noting the date, just 2 years after her birth. The timing felt significant, though she couldn't quite grasp why. "Tell me about her," Eli said suddenly, as he set eggs to cooking in a cast-iron pan. "About Rebecca. What was she like as a mother?" Maren settled into one of the handmade chairs, surprised by how much she wanted to share these memories with someone who had loved her mother. She was everything good," she began slowly. "Patient when I was difficult, strong when things fell apart, hopeful even when there wasn't much reason to be." She paused, watching Eli's face as he listened with the intensity of someone gathering precious fragments of a lost life. "She worked as a librarian after I was grown, said books were the best company she'd ever found besides family. She read to me every night when I was little. Fairy tales mostly, but also stories about brave women who changed their worlds through kindness rather than force." Eli smiled at this, remembering Rebecca's love of books, how she had always carried a novel with her during that long-ago summer. "She tried to get me to read Jane Austen once," he said. "I didn't understand the appeal then, but now I think I might have been too young to appreciate stories about love that overcomes obstacles." "She never married until I was 12, Maren continued. "James was wonderful, patient with her silences, and to the daughter who came with no explanation of her origins, but sometimes I would catch her looking at that locket with such sadness. I always wondered what she was remembering." The eggs were ready, and Eli served them alongside thick slices of bread toasted on the wood stove. Simple food, but prepared with care and served with a generosity that made Maren's throat tight with emotion. When had anyone last cooked for her without expecting something in return? Tommy came running in from the porch, his cheeks red with cold and excitement. "The swing is perfect," he announced. "It goes just fast enough to feel like flying, but not so fast that you get scared." "That's the best kind of swing," Eli agreed solemnly, and Tommy beamed at being taken seriously by this kind adult. As they ate, Maren found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told Eli about David's death, about the slow slide from stability into desperate poverty, about the jobs that had disappeared and the apartments they could no longer afford. But she also talked about Tommy's resilience, his ability to find joy in small things, his unwavering faith that his mother would somehow make everything all right. "He's a remarkable boy," Eli observed, watching Tommy carefully cut his eggs into precise squares before eating them. "Rebecca would have been proud. She never got to meet him," Maren said softly. "She died just before David and I married, but I like to think she would have loved him." "She would have," Eli said with certainty. "Rebecca had a gift for seeing the best in people, especially children." They were interrupted by the sound of a buggy pulling into the yard. Through the kitchen window, Eli saw Bishop Samuel Yoder climbing. Down from his seat, his expression suggesting this was not a social call, Maren noticed Eli's sudden tension. "Is something wrong?" "The bishop," Eli explained quietly. "He leads our church community. He's probably wondering about my English visitors." Tommy looked up from his breakfast with curiosity rather than alarm. At 6, he had no concept of religious boundaries or cultural tensions. He saw only another adult who might be interested in hearing about the wonderful swing on the porch. The knock came firm and measured, and Eli rose to answer it with the careful dignity that marked all his interactions with church authority. Bishop Samuel entered the kitchen with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed in every home in his community. "Good morning, Eli," he said in Pennsylvania Dutch, then switched to English as his eyes took in the two strangers at the kitchen table. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Bishop," Eli replied. "May I introduce Maren Peterson and her son Tommy? They were in need of warmth and food on this cold morning." Samuel's weathered face remained neutral as he studied the visitors. At 72, he had led the Cedar Valley congregation through decades of change and challenge. He understood the balance between Christian charity and community boundaries, between helping neighbors and maintaining the separation that kept their faith community strong. "Mrs. Peterson," he said with careful courtesy, "I trust Eli is taking good care of you and your son." "He's been very kind," Maren replied, sensing the undercurrents in the room even if she didn't fully understand them. "We don't want to cause any problems." "Problems?" Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly. "Who speaks of problems? We are commanded to show hospitality to strangers." But his eyes, when they met Eli's, carried a different message, questions that would need answers once the guests were gone. Tommy, unaware of the adult tensions, slipped down from his chair and approached the bishop with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you Amish too?" he asked. "Do you make furniture like Mr. Eli?" A smile tugged at Samuel's stern mouth despite himself. "I am a farmer," he said. "I grow corn and raise chickens. But like Eli, I try to make things that are useful and good." "That's important," Tommy said solemnly. "My mama says the most important thing is to help people when they need it." The simple wisdom of a child seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere. Samuel's expression softened as he looked at this earnest little boy who spoke of helping others with such natural conviction. "Your mama is a wise woman," Samuel said gently. As the bishop prepared to leave, he paused at the door and spoke quietly to Eli in their shared German dialect. Maren couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone of gentle warning, of concern for a friend who might be walking into complicated territory. After Samuel's buggy had disappeared down the lane, Eli returned to the kitchen to find Maren gathering their coats. "We should go," she said, not meeting his eyes. "We've caused enough talk for one morning." "You've caused nothing but blessing," Eli said firmly. "But perhaps it would be wise for you to have a warm place to stay while you're in Cedar. Valley, the community center has rooms, clean and heated." Maren's face flushed with something between gratitude and shame. She had been hoping he might make such an offer, but had been too proud to ask. "We can pay something," she said quickly. "Not much, but—" "Payment is not necessary," Eli interrupted. "Christian charity requires no coin," as they prepared to leave. For the community center, Tommy ran back to the porch swing for one final ride. Watching him through the kitchen window, Eli made a decision that would change everything. "Maren," he said quietly, "would you and Tommy join me for Christmas Eve service tomorrow night? It would mean a great deal to me to have Rebecca's daughter share our celebration of Christ's birth." The invitation hung between them, loaded with significance neither was quite ready to examine. But looking at Tommy's joyful face as he swung beneath the winter sky, Maren found herself nodding. "Yes," she said, "we'd be honored." That evening, alone in his workshop, while Maren and Tommy settled into the community center's modest but warm accommodations, Eli found himself unable to concentrate on his woodworking. His hands moved restlessly over the tools, straightening and rearranging things that were already perfectly organized. Finally, he knelt beside his workbench and pulled out the old wooden chest that held his most private possessions. Beneath blueprints for furniture and sketches of projects never completed, wrapped in oiled cloth that still smelled faintly of cedar, lay Rebecca's letters. 17 letters. Each one read so many times that the paper had grown soft along the folds. With trembling fingers, Eli unwrapped the bundle and selected the first letter, dated June 15th, 1984. "My dearest Eli," it began in Rebecca's careful handwriting. "I know I shouldn't write to you. Uncle Henry would be scandalized, and I suspect your family would be none too pleased either. But I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday, about faith and freedom. You spoke of feeling caught between two worlds, and I wanted you to know that you're not alone in that feeling." The letter went on to describe her own struggles with belonging, too educated for some circles, too idealistic for others, caught between her family's expectations and her own dreams of making a difference in the world. She wrote about the beauty she saw in Amish life, the peace that seemed to emanate from people who had found their place in the world, but also about her fear of losing herself in someone else's certainty. Eli moved to the second letter, then the third, watching their relationship unfold again through Rebecca's words. She wrote about their walks through the meadows, about the way he explained his faith without trying to convert her, about the gentle strength she saw in his hands as he worked with wood and growing things. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she had written in the 8th letter. "Not just with your kindness, though that drew me first, but with your struggle to choose authentically, to honor both your heart and your conscience. I see you wrestling with questions that most people never even think to ask, and I admire your courage, even when it keeps you awake at night." The later letters grew more complex, filled with her attempts to understand Amish theology, her questions about baptism and commitment, her genuine desire to find a way to bridge their different worlds. She had attended services, had learned some German phrases, had even tried her hand at traditional cooking under the patient tutelage of some of the Amish women. But doubt had crept into the final letters, a growing recognition that love might not be enough to overcome the vast differences in their backgrounds and expectations. "I'm trying to imagine myself in your world," she had written in the 16th letter, "but I keep coming back to the question of what I would lose in the process. Not just the external things, the education I worked so hard for, the career I dreamed of, the wider world I've always felt called to serve, but something essential about who I am. And I wonder if asking you to leave your world for mine would require the same kind of essential sacrifice from you." The last letter was dated August 20th, 1984. just 3 days before she had left Cedar Valley to return to Philadelphia. My beloved Eli, I've decided to leave without saying goodbye because I don't trust myself to be strong enough if I see your face. We both know this summer has been precious beyond words, but we also know it can't continue as it is. You have a choice to make. About your baptism, about the life you want to commit to, and I can't be the reason you choose against your deepest convictions. Whatever you decide, please know that loving you has changed me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. You've shown me what it means to take faith seriously, to consider the weight of our choices, not just on ourselves, but on the communities that shape us. I will carry that lesson and my love for you wherever I go. Be well, my dear friend. Be happy. Be at peace with the choice that honors who you were meant to be. Eli's vision blurred as he finished reading. 40 years later, Rebecca's words still had the power to cut straight to his heart. She had understood even then the impossible position they were both in. She had loved him enough to set him free to choose his path without the weight of her need influencing his decision, and he had chosen. Had knelt for baptism the following spring, had committed himself fully to the Amish way of life, had married Sarah 2 years later, and built a good, faithful life within the boundaries of his community. But now, holding these letters again, he wondered if he had chosen rightly. Not because his marriage to Sarah had been wrong, it had been blessed and full of genuine love, but because somewhere in his choice he had closed his heart to the possibility that love might come in forms his community couldn't easily accept. A soft knock at the workshop door interrupted his brooding. He quickly rewrapped the letters and returned them to their hiding place before opening the door to find Maren standing in the pool of light from his workshop lamp. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said. "I saw your light and wanted to thank you again for your kindness, and to ask—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Tommy found something in the room at the community center, a newspaper clipping that had fallen behind the dresser. She held out a piece of yellowed newsprint, and Eli's heart nearly stopped. It was Rebecca's obituary from the Philadelphia Inquirer, dated 7 years ago. The headline read, "Local Librarian Remembered for Dedication to Literacy Programs." "Rebecca Louise Hartwell Peterson," Maren read aloud, "died peacefully on Tuesday after a courageous battle with cancer. She is survived by her daughter, Maren Peterson, and son-in-law, David Peterson. Rebecca devoted 30 years to the Philadelphia public library system, where she developed innovative programs for adult literacy and children's reading enhancement." Eli sank into his workbench chair as the reality hit him fully. Not only was Rebecca gone, but she had died using the name Peterson, had taken her daughter's married name as her own, creating a family unit that honored the life Maren had built. "She never remarried after James died," Maren explained quietly. "Said she had been blessed with one great love and didn't expect another. When I got married, she changed her name to match mine and David's, said we were the family that mattered now." The obituary went on to list Rebecca's accomplishments, her community service, the scholarship fund established in her memory. But Eli's eyes kept returning to one phrase. She was known for her belief that love transcends boundaries and that understanding between different communities begins with individual acts of compassion. She became who she was always meant to be, Eli said softly. "Yes," Maren agreed, "but she never forgot where that path began. She kept your locket, kept your initials close to her heart. That has to mean something." Standing there in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the evidence of the life he had built, Eli realized that Rebecca's greatest gift to him might not have been their summer love, but this moment. The chance to meet her daughter, to see what their love had made possible even when they couldn't be together. "It means everything," he said, looking into Maren's eyes and seeing Rebecca's courage staring back at him. "It means she trusted me with the most precious thing she had, the daughter she loved more than life itself." The next morning brought Christmas Eve, with a clarity that made the snow-covered fields sparkle like scattered diamonds. Eli woke before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of heading straight to his workshop, he found himself in Sarah's kitchen. Pulling out her old recipe box, the wooden box carved by his own hands as a wedding gift 42 years ago, contained more than recipes. Each handwritten card told a story of their life together, notes about which dishes the visiting minister preferred, modifications for community meals, reminders about food allergies among their neighbors' children. Sarah's careful handwriting filled every card, along with occasional annotations in different colored ink, as she perfected each recipe over the years. Eli pulled out the card for her famous cinnamon rolls, the ones she had made every Christmas Eve for 4 decades. At the bottom of the card, in Sarah's flowing script, was a note she had added just 2 years before her death. The secret ingredient isn't the extra butter or the perfect rising time. It's the love you put into making something special for people who matter. Food made with grudging hands feeds only the body, but food made with joy feeds the soul. He could almost hear her voice as he read the words, could see her patient smile as she taught him the finer points of working with yeast and measuring spices by feel rather than strict measurement. Sarah had been the heart of hospitality in their community, the one who made sure no visitor left their home hungry or uncomforted. As he began mixing the dough, Eli found himself thinking about the parallels between his beloved wife and the woman he had loved before her. Both had possessed the rare gift of seeing beyond surface differences to the human need beneath. Sarah had never questioned his desire to help struggling neighbors, had never made him choose between his compassion and his commitment to their community. The kitchen filled with the warm sense of cinnamon and rising bread as Eli worked. He made enough rolls for his small household and plenty extra, enough to share with Maren and Tommy, enough to take to the evening service where the tradition was for families to contribute to a shared meal after worship. By mid-morning, he was walking through the crisp air toward the community center, carrying a basket of fresh rolls that were still warm from the oven. He found Maren and Tommy in the small sitting room, both of them clean and dressed in their best clothes, despite the obvious limitations of their wardrobe. Tommy wore a button-down shirt that was slightly too large, and pants that had been carefully mended at the knees. His hair was combed with mathematical precision, and his face shone with the peculiar brightness that came from extra thorough washing. But it was the effort behind his appearance that touched Eli's heart. The evidence of a mother who wanted her son to look his best despite their circumstances. Maren had performed her own quiet miracle of transformation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that emphasized the delicate bone structure she had inherited from Rebecca. Her dress was nothing fancy, a simple navy blue that had seen better years, but she wore it with a dignity that reminded Eli powerfully of her mother's natural grace. "You both look wonderful," Eli said, meaning it completely. Tommy beamed at the compliment. "Mama said we needed to look respectful for church. She taught me how to tie my shoes the fancy way with loops that stay tight." "Those are very fine shoe loops indeed," Eli agreed solemnly, then turned to Maren. "I brought you something, Sarah's cinnamon rolls. It was her tradition to make them every Christmas Eve." Maren accepted the basket with hands that trembled slightly. "You didn't need to." "I wanted to," Eli said gently. "Sarah would have wanted me to share them with Rebecca's daughter." As they walked together toward the white church building where the evening service would be held, Eli found himself seeing his community through outsider eyes once again. Children played in the snow between the houses, their bright scarves and mittens the only splashes of color against the pristine white landscape. Adults moved with the unhurried pace of people whose day was structured by purpose rather than urgency. "It's beautiful," Maren said quietly, echoing his own thoughts. "Peaceful, like stepping into a different century where people still had time to really see each other." "The peace comes with a price," Eli replied honestly. "Structure." rules, the agreement to put community needs before individual desires. It's not always easy. Tommy ran ahead to examine a wooden sled that some children had left beside the church steps. "Can I try it?" he called back. "After service," Eli promised. "There will be time for sledding while the adults visit." Inside the church, Eli felt the familiar mix of comfort and tension that came with bringing English visitors to worship. The plain wooden benches, the absence of decorative elements, the sense of quiet reverence that filled the space, these things that felt like home to him might seem stark or unwelcoming to outsiders. But as they found seats toward the back, several community members approached with quiet words of welcome. Martha Yoder, the bishop's wife, pressed a small wrapped package into Tommy's hands with a whispered instruction to save it for after the service. Jacob Stoltzfus offered Maren a worn hymnal and took a moment to show her how to follow along despite the German text. The service itself was a blend of ancient and intimate, songs sung without instrumental accompaniment, prayers offered in voices weathered by decades of faith. A sermon delivered in the bishop's careful mix of German and English that honored both the traditional language of worship and the presence of guests who needed translation. Bishop Samuel spoke about the Christmas story, about Mary and Joseph, finding shelter among strangers, about how God's greatest gifts often came through the hospitality of ordinary people who opened their doors to unexpected visitors. Tonight, we remember that the Christ child was born among people who had room in their hearts even when they had little room in their homes, he said, his eyes briefly meeting Eli's across the congregation. We are called to be such people, to see the sacred in the stranger, the holy in the hungry, the blessed in those who seek shelter from life's storms. Tommy sat remarkably still throughout the service, his eyes wide with wonder at the unfamiliar rituals, but clearly sensing the reverence that surrounded him. When the congregation rose to sing, he hummed along with the melodies, even though he couldn't understand the words. During the closing prayer, Eli felt a small hand slip into his. Tommy had reached across the space between them, seeking connection with the kind man who had shown him such unexpected warmth. The trust implicit in that simple gesture nearly undid Eli's careful composure. After the service, as promised, Tommy joined the other children for sledding behind the church. His laughter mingled with theirs as they raced down the gentle slope, and watching him, Eli realized how long it had been since he had seen pure, uncomplicated joy expressed so freely. "He's been so worried," Maren said softly, standing beside Eli as they watched the children play, "trying to be brave for me, trying not to complain about being cold or hungry or scared. But look at him now." Indeed, Tommy was radiant with the simple pleasure of childhood accepted and celebrated. The other children had welcomed him without question, had shown him the best spots for sledding, and shared their mittens when his small hands grew cold. "Children understand what adults often forget," Eli observed, "that joy shared is joy multiplied, that kindness costs nothing but gives everything." As the evening wound down and families began to gather their children for the journey home, Bishop Samuel approached them with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Peterson," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you for joining our worship tonight. Your presence blessed us." "Thank you for welcoming us," Maren replied. "It was beautiful. Different from what I'm used to, but beautiful." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Different need not mean divided," he said. "We serve the same Christ, even when our ways of serving look unlike." The bishop's words stayed with Eli as they walked back, toward the community center through the starlit night. Behind them, Tommy chattered excitedly about the sledding and the children he had met, and the small wooden toy he had found in Martha Yoder's gift, a simple carved horse that fit perfectly in his pocket. Christmas morning dawned with the kind of crystalline beauty that made even the most practical souls believe in miracles. Eli had risen before sunrise to tend his animals and complete his morning chores, but his mind kept drifting to Maren and Tommy at the community center, On impulse, he wrapped some of Sarah's cinnamon rolls and made his way across the village as the first light painted the snow-covered roofs in shades of rose and gold. He found them in the small kitchen attached to the community center, Maren making coffee with the careful economy of someone who had learned to make little stretch far. Tommy sat at the small table, turning something over in his hands with the intense concentration that only children brought to truly important matters. "Merry Christmas," Eli said softly, not wanting to startle them. "Merry Christmas," Maren replied, and there was something in her voice, a tremor of barely controlled emotion, that made Eli look more closely at her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying, and there was a tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless worry. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Tommy looked up then, and Eli saw that the boy was holding an envelope, old and yellowed at the edges, with writing that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. "We were going through Mama's things," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact tone that children used to describe even momentous events, "looking for something special for Christmas morning. And we found this letter in the bottom of her suitcase. It has your name on it." The envelope was indeed addressed to Eli Fisher in Rebecca's familiar handwriting, but the paper was aged in a way that suggested it had been written long ago and kept for decades. Maren's hands shook slightly as she held it out to him. I think my mother wrote this but never sent it," she said. "I found it with some other papers after she died, but I didn't read it then. I wasn't ready. But last night after the service, I felt like maybe it was time." Eli accepted the letter with reverent hands, noting how the envelope had been opened and carefully resealed, as if Maren had wrestled with the decision to read something so private. His name was written in Rebecca's young handwriting, the careful script she had used in the letters he kept hidden in his workshop, not the more confident hand of her later years. "Did you read it?" he asked quietly. Maren nodded, tears threatening to spill over again. "I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have, but it explains so many things about my childhood, about why she made certain choices, and it's addressed to you, but she kept it for 40 years. I think she wanted you to have it someday." With trembling fingers, Eli opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The date at the top made his heart skip. September 15th, 1984. Just 3 weeks after Rebecca had left Cedar Valley, 3 weeks into what must have been the most difficult period of her young life. "My dearest Eli, I've started this letter a dozen times and thrown away each attempt. But I can't seem to stop trying to find the words to tell you what I should have said before I left. I told myself it would be easier for both of us if I simply disappeared, if I let you choose your path without the complication of my feelings clouding your judgment. But I realize now that in my cowardice, I may have left you with questions that will haunt you for years to come. I need you to know that I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I loved you too much to let you sacrifice everything you believe in for someone who might never truly belong in your world. I saw the way your family looked at me during those last weeks, the worry in their eyes when they thought about their son choosing an English woman over his faith community. I heard the whispers, the gentle but firm suggestions that perhaps I might find happiness elsewhere, that perhaps what we felt was simply the romance of summer rather than the deep love that could sustain a lifetime. But Eli, what we shared was real. Please never doubt that. You showed me what it means to love someone not for what they can give you, but for who they are at the deepest level. You loved my questions, my restless spirit, my need to understand the world beyond the boundaries of any single community. You never tried to change me, only to help me see my own worth through kinder eyes. I want you to know that I'm carrying part of you with me in ways you couldn't have imagined when we said goodbye. I don't mean just memories, though those are precious beyond words. I mean something more immediate, more miraculous. I'm pregnant, Eli. Our love created a life, and in 3 months, I will hold our child in my arms. Eli's vision blurred as the words hit him with the force of physical blows. Pregnant, Rebecca had been carrying his child when she left Cedar Valley, had faced that overwhelming reality alone while he went through the motions of preparing for baptism and trying to forget what they had shared. "I know what you're thinking as you read this," the letter continued, "and I need you to understand why. I'm not telling you in person why I'm writing this letter that I may never have the courage to send. If I told you now, you would feel obligated to marry me, to find some way to make it work between our two worlds. You would sacrifice your deepest convictions out of duty to me and our child, and eventually you would resent both of us for the choice you felt forced to make. I can't live with that possibility. I won't be the reason you turn away from the life you've spent 23 years preparing to embrace. So I'm making this choice alone, for both of us. I'm going to raise our child as my own, without your name or your community's knowledge. I will tell him or her about you someday, about your kindness, your strength, your struggle to choose authentically between competing loyalties. But I won't burden our child with the knowledge that their existence caused their father to abandon his deepest beliefs. If you receive this letter, it means something has happened to me, and I'm trusting that our child, now grown, will find their way to you when the time is right. I've arranged for this letter to be given to Maren, along with my other important papers, with instructions that she should seek you out if she ever needs help or simply wants to understand where she came from. Please know that every day of raising our daughter has been a gift. She has your eyes, Eli, and your gentle strength. She questions everything just like her mother, but she also has your capacity for deep loyalty and quiet faith. She may not follow the plain path you chose, but she honors the values you tried to teach me during our brief, precious time together. I never married Eli. I told everyone that Maren's father died before we could wed, and I let them assume what they would about the circumstances. It seemed kinder than the truth that I loved a man so much I couldn't bear to ask him to choose between his heart and his God. I've watched you from afar over the years, heard news of your marriage and your life in Cedar Valley through the few connections I maintained in rural Pennsylvania. I'm glad you found happiness with Sarah. She seems like a woman who deserves the love you have to give, and I hope she's brought you the peace that I never could. If something happens to me, if Maren comes to you lost and searching for answers about where she belongs in the world, please remember that she is the best of both of us. She carries your capacity for faith and my need to ask difficult questions. She will need both gifts to find her place in a world that often demands people choose one or the other. Love her as I have loved her, not by trying to shape her into someone she's not, but by helping her discover who she was always meant to become. All my love, always, Rebecca P.S. Her full name is Maren Rebecca Hartwell. I gave her your mother's middle name because I wanted her to carry something of your family, even if she could never claim it openly. The letter fluttered to the floor as Eli's hands went limp with shock. Maren was not just Rebecca's daughter, she was his daughter. The young woman he had been helping out of charity and memory was his own flesh and blood, the child he and Rebecca had created during those magical summer months 40 years ago. He looked up to find Maren watching him with eyes that were indeed his own, the same grey-green that he saw in mirrors, the same mixture of hope and wariness that he recognized from his own reflection during times of uncertainty. "You're my daughter," he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of 4 decades of unknowing. Tommy looked back and forth between the adults, sensing the magnitude of what had just been revealed, even if he didn't fully understand. Does that mean you're my grandpa?" he asked with the directness that only children could manage. Eli knelt down to Tommy's level, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he looked into the face of the grandson he had never imagined. He would have. "Yes," he said softly, reaching out to touch Tommy's cheek with wonder. "I suppose it does." The silence that followed Tommy's innocent question stretched like a bridge, suspended over an impossible chasm. Eli remained kneeling before his grandson, while Maren stood frozen by the small kitchen table, both of them struggling to absorb the magnitude of what Rebecca's letter had revealed. "Mama," Tommy said softly, sensing the emotional earthquake that had just shifted the ground beneath all their feet. "Why are you crying?" Maren wiped her cheeks with the back of her head, not even realizing that tears had begun to fall. "Happy tears, sweetheart," she managed. "Sometimes people cry when something wonderful and surprising happens." But even as she spoke the words, Maren felt overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions surging through her. Wonder, yes, at discovering the identity of the father she had never known. Gratitude that he was a man of such obvious kindness and strength. But also anger, sharp and unexpected, at her mother for keeping this secret, for letting Maren grow up believing she was unwanted by her father when the truth was so much more complicated. Eli rose slowly, his carpenter's knees protesting the sudden movement, but his eyes never leaving Maren's face. Now that he knew to look for it, he could see so much of himself in her features. The stubborn set of her jaw when she was thinking hard, the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when listening carefully, the unconscious grace with which she moved her hands when she was nervous. 40 years, he whispered. 40 years I've had a daughter in the world and never knew. She was protecting you, Maren said, and there was fierce loyalty in her voice, despite her own conflicted feelings. She didn't want you to sacrifice your faith for duty. Sacrifice? Eli's voice cracked. Maren, you were never a sacrifice. You are, a gift I never imagined I deserved to receive. Tommy had been watching this exchange with the peculiar intensity that children brought to adult conversations they didn't quite understand but sensed were important. Now he approached Eli with the careful steps of a 6-year-old who had learned not to assume adults would welcome his presence. "If you're my grandpa," he said solemnly, "does that mean you'll teach me to make things like you make?" Mama said my daddy who died was good with his hands too. The simple question broke through the emotional paralysis that had gripped both adults. Eli looked down at this earnest little boy who had just inherited not only a grandfather, but an entire, extended family he had never known existed. "I would be honored to teach you," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "Would you like to start today?" Tommy's face lit up with pure joy. "Really? On Christmas? Especially on Christmas," Eli said, then looked up at Maren with uncertainty. "If that's all right with your mother." Maren nodded, not trusting her voice. The sight of her son and her father, planning their first project together was almost too much to bear. All those years of wondering, of feeling incomplete, of searching for some sense of belonging in a world that often felt hostile to single mothers and fatherless children. And here was the answer she had never dared to hope for. They spent the morning in Eli's workshop, where Tommy was introduced to the mysteries of wood grain and the proper way to hold a small, whittling knife. Eli's patience with the boy was infinite, his gentle corrections delivered with the kind of loving attention that spoke of dreams long deferred finally finding expression. "The wood will tell you which way it wants to be carved," Eli explained, guiding Tommy's small hands as they worked on what would become a simple whistle. "You must listen with your fingers, feel for the path of least resistance." Maren watched from her perch on an old wooden stool, marveling at how naturally Tommy responded to this grandfather he had known for less than an hour. There was something in Eli's manner, patient, encouraging, present, that Tommy had been hungry for without knowing it. David had been a loving stepfather, but he had died when Tommy was only 4. The boy barely remembered what it felt like to have a man in his life who was invested in his growth and learning. As the morning progressed, other members of the Amish community began arriving for the traditional Christmas Day visits. The first was Martha Yoder, the bishop's wife, carrying a basket of her famous molasses cookies and wearing her warmest shawl against the December cold. "Eli," she called as she approached the workshop, "I wanted to thank you again for bringing your guests to service last night. The boy especially brought such joy to our children." She stopped short when she saw the scene inside the workshop. Tommy concentrated on his whittling under Eli's careful supervision, while Maren watched with the kind of maternal contentment that only came when a child was truly happy. "Martha," Eli said, rising to greet her, "I'm glad you came. There's something I need to share with you, with the community." Something in his tone made Martha study his face more carefully. She had known Eli Fisher for 40 years, had watched him navigate the joys and sorrows of life with the steady faith that marked the best of their people, but she had never seen this particular combination of wonder, uncertainty, and fierce protectiveness that now marked his features. "What is it, Eli?" she asked gently. "Maren is my daughter," he said simply. "My biological daughter. Her mother was Rebecca Hartwell, the English girl I knew during my Rumspringa." Martha's basket nearly slipped from her hands. The implications of this revelation rippled through her mind like stones thrown into still water. An unmarried relationship 40 years ago, a child born outside the community. The question of what this meant for Eli's standing, for the family that had just been revealed, for the careful boundaries that kept their community distinct from the English world. But as she looked at Tommy, so absorbed in his work and so clearly thriving under Eli's attention, her first instinct was not judgment but protection. "Does the boy know?" she asked quietly. "He knows I'm his grandfather now," Eli replied. "The rest, the circumstances of Maren's birth, the choices that were made, that's for later conversations. When he's older." Martha nodded slowly. "And you're certain about the parentage?" In response, Eli showed her Rebecca's letter, watching as the older woman read with increasing amazement. When she finished, Martha was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the facts, but their implications for the community she had helped guide for decades. "The bishop will need to know," she said finally. "The church leadership will need to discuss what this means." "I understand," Eli said. "I won't ask the community to compromise its principles for my personal situation. But Martha, they're family. Whatever happens, I can't turn away from them now." Before Martha could respond, the workshop door opened again to admit Bishop Samuel himself, along with Jacob Stoltzfus and his wife Ruth. They had come for the traditional Christmas visits, bringing small gifts and warm wishes, but their expressions grew serious as they sensed the weight of the conversation they had interrupted. "Bishop," Eli said, squaring his shoulders with the quiet dignity that had always marked his character, "I was hoping to speak with you today. About Maren and Tommy, about their place in my life." Samuel's weathered face remained neutral, but his eyes were kind as they moved from Eli to Maren to Tommy, who was still absorbed in his whittling project. "I'm listening, Eli." The story came out in measured phrases, with Martha occasionally adding details from Rebecca's letter. Eli spoke honestly about his relationship with Rebecca, about the choices they had both made, about the daughter he had never known existed until this morning. As he talked, more community members arrived for their Christmas visits, drawn by some instinct that told them something significant was happening in Eli Fisher's workshop. Word spread quietly through the group, not as gossip, but as shared concern for a family trying to determine how God was calling them to respond to an unexpected gift. Tommy, finally satisfied with his whistle, blew a tentative note that came out clear and sweet. The sound seemed to break through the adult tension, reminding everyone present that at the center of this complicated situation was a child who had done nothing more than accept the love of a grandfather he had just discovered. "Play it again," Ruth Stoltzfus said softly, and Tommy obliged with a smile that could have melted winter itself. Bishop Samuel stepped forward and knelt to Tommy's level, just as Eli had done earlier. "That's a fine whistle, young man. Did your grandfather teach you to make it?" "Yes, sir," Tommy replied politely. "He says the wood tells you what it wants to be, and you have to listen with your fingers." "That's very wise," Samuel agreed, then stood and faced the assembled group. "Friends, we have before us a situation that requires both wisdom and grace. Eli has discovered that God has blessed him with a daughter and grandson he never knew existed. The circumstances are complicated, but the love is simple." He paused, looking at each face in the circle that had formed around them. "I propose we call a community meeting for tomorrow evening, not to judge, but to discern together how we might welcome this family while honoring the principles that guide our faith." The community vote token, a simple wooden disc that was passed among members during important decisions, appeared in Samuel's hand. It was worn smooth by decades of use, marked only with a small cross carved into its surface. "All in favor of welcoming Eli's family, while we prayerfully consider their place among us?" Samuel asked. The token passed from hand to hand, each person holding it briefly before passing it on. Martha Yoder held it longest, her eyes closed in what appeared to be silent prayer. When it returned to Samuel, he smiled. "It appears we are unanimous in our desire to show hospitality to these dear ones while we seek God's guidance about the future." Tommy, who had been watching this adult ritual with fascination, raised his small hand. "Excuse me, Mr. Bishop. What does that mean exactly?" Samuel's stern face softened into something approaching a grin. "It means, young Tommy, that you and your mother are welcome at our table while we all figure out what God wants us to do next." The boy considered this seriously. "That's good," he said finally. "Mama and me, we've been figuring out what to do next for a really long time. It'll be nice to have help." The community meeting was held the following evening in the same plain wooden church where Maren and Tommy had attended their first Amish service just 2 nights earlier. But the atmosphere was different now, charged with the weight of decision, heavy with the understanding that what they chose tonight would shape not only 3 lives, but the character of their community itself. The old German Bible that had belonged to the first Amish settlers in Cedar Valley sat open on the simple wooden table at the front of the church. Its leather binding was worn smooth by generations of hands, its pages marked with careful annotations in multiple languages, as successive church leaders had wrestled with questions of faith and community. Bishop Samuel stood beside the ancient book, his weathered hands resting lightly on its open pages. He had spent the past day in prayer and consultation with the church elders, seeking wisdom for a situation that had no clear precedent in their community's careful traditions. "Friends," he began in his deep, measured voice, "we gather tonight, not as judges but as seekers of God's will. Before us is a family, Eli Fisher and his daughter Maren and her son Tommy, who find themselves at a crossroads that none of them could have foreseen." Eli sat in the front row, with Maren beside him and Tommy on his other side. The boy was unusually quiet, sensing the solemnity of the occasion, even if he didn't fully understand its implications. He wore his best shirt again, the one that was still slightly too large, and he held the wooden whistle he had carved the day before like a talisman. "We have heard Eli's testimony," Samuel continued, "about events that took place 40 years ago, before his baptism, during a time when he was still deciding between the English world and our plain life. We have heard how God has now revealed to him a daughter he never knew existed, a granddaughter-in-law who died too young, and a great-grandson who brings joy wherever he goes." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered congregation. Tommy had indeed brought joy to their community in his brief time among them. His wonder at their simple pleasures, his innocent questions, his ready acceptance of their ways had touched hearts that had grown perhaps too accustomed to their blessings. "The question before us," Samuel said, raising his voice slightly to regain attention, "is not whether Eli acted rightly or wrongly 4 decades ago. God has already worked his forgiveness and redemption in Eli's life through his faithful marriage to our dear Sarah and his years of service to this community. The question is how we respond now to the family God has placed before us." Martha Yoder rose from her seat in the third row, the movement causing several heads to turn in her direction. As the bishop's wife and one of the community's most respected voices, her words would carry significant weight in the deliberations to come. "May I speak, Bishop?" she asked formally. "Of course, Martha. I've known Eli Fisher for 40 years, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet church. "I've watched him build furniture that will outlast us all, tend crops that feed our families, care for neighbors in times of trouble and celebration. I've watched him love Sarah with the kind of devotion that honors marriage itself." She paused, her eyes moving to where Tommy sat between his mother and grandfather. "Yesterday I saw him teach that little boy to whittle. I saw patience I haven't witnessed since my own children were small. I saw a man who has spent 40 years waiting for a purpose he didn't even know he was missing." Her voice softened. "That child needs a grandfather. His mother needs a father. And our Eli, our good, faithful Eli, needs the family God has finally chosen to give him." Other voices joined the conversation. Jacob Stoltzfus spoke about the Christian duty to welcome strangers and care for widows and orphans. Ruth Miller shared her observation of how naturally Tommy had fit among their children during Christmas Eve sledding. Young David Byler, recently baptized himself, asked thoughtful questions about how they might help an English family understand their ways without compromising their own faith. But it was old Heinrich Miller, the general store owner who had first shown kindness to Maren, who posed the hardest question. "What of baptism?" he asked in his careful English, mindful of the non-Pennsylvania Dutch speakers present. "The girl and boy, they are not baptized into our faith. How do we welcome them fully while honoring the boundaries that define us as a people?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a winter fire, visible, present, impossible to ignore. Baptism was the cornerstone of Amish identity, the commitment that separated members from the outside world and bound them to the community's covenant of faith. Samuel opened the old German Bible to a passage he had marked earlier, his finger tracing the familiar words. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." He did not say, "Whoever welcomes one such baptized child." Tommy, who had been listening with the intense concentration that children brought to adult conversations they sensed, were about them, raised his small hand. "Yes, Tommy?" Samuel said gently. "Mr. Bishop, sir, what's baptism, and why does everyone look worried when they talk about it?" The innocence of the question cut through the theological complexity like a knife through butter, reminding everyone present that they were discussing the fate of a 6-year-old who wanted only to belong somewhere safe and loving. Samuel knelt down to Tommy's level, his weathered face gentle with the kind of patience that came from a lifetime of explaining complex faith to simple hearts. From his pocket, he drew out Sarah's wooden cross, the small, plain cross that Eli's wife had carved during the long winter evenings of her final year, when her hands had needed something to do while her body fought its losing battle with illness. "Baptism," Samuel said softly, holding the cross so Tommy could see it, "is like making a promise to God and to your neighbors. It's when a grown-up person says, 'I want to live the way Jesus taught us to live, and I want to do it together with other people who made the same promise.'" Tommy studied the simple wooden cross with the serious attention he gave to all important matters. "Like when I promised Mama I would try to be brave when Daddy died." "Very much like that," Samuel agreed, "except this promise is about how you want to live your whole life. And you can't make that promise for someone else," Tommy said with the logic that often surprised adults. "Because it wouldn't be real if someone else made it for you." A ripple of amazement moved through the congregation. This 6-year-old had just articulated one of the fundamental principles of Amish faith, that baptism must be a personal choice, made by adults who fully understood the commitment they were making. "That's exactly right," Samuel said, rising. Slowly, he held Sarah's cross up so the entire congregation could see it. Sarah Fisher carved this cross during her final winter with us. She told me then that she was thinking about faith that crosses boundaries, about how love for God shows itself in love for neighbors, even neighbors who are different from us. He turned back to the assembly, the small wooden cross cradled in his palm, like a prayer made tangible. Sarah understood something that perhaps we sometimes forget in our concern for maintaining proper boundaries. Faith is not about keeping people out. It's about drawing people into the love of Christ. Eli's eyes filled with tears as he recognized the cross Sarah had spent so many evening hours carving. She had never told him it was finished, had kept it as a surprise for some special occasion that never came before her death. Now Samuel was holding it up as a symbol of inclusion rather than exclusion, of love that transcended the careful categories their community used to define belonging. "I propose," Samuel continued, "that we welcome Eli's family not as full members. That choice must be theirs to make when and if they feel called to baptism, but as beloved guests who are part of our extended family. We will care for them, teach them our ways if they wish to learn, include them in our celebrations and our sorrows." Martha Yoder stood again. "And if they choose to leave, if the English world calls them back, then we will love them as they go," Samuel replied simply. "Love that demands permanence is not love, it's possession. We will love them while they're here, support them if they choose to stay, and bless them if they choose to leave." Young David Byler raised his hand. "What about work, housing? They can't stay in the community center forever." "I've been thinking about that," Eli said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "My house is large, built for a family I never had. Maren could take Sarah's sewing room as a bedroom. Tommy could have the room we always kept ready for the children who never came. As for work, Maren has skills we need. She can read and write English better than most of us, keep books, help with correspondence with English businesses." He paused, looking at his daughter with wonder still fresh in his eyes. "And I could use help in the workshop. Good furniture takes time to build properly, and I'm not getting any younger." Maren, who had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, finally found her voice. "I don't want to cause division in your community," she said. "Tommy and I have survived on our own before. We can do it again if our presence here causes problems." "Child," Martha Yoder said firmly, "you're not causing problems. You're solving them. We've had an old man rattling around alone in a house, too big for him, working too hard because he had no reason to slow down. We've got community work that needs doing and no one with quite the right skills to do it. And our children have been asking when they would get to play with that little boy who was so good at sledding." Tommy perked up at this last comment. "Really? They want to play with me again?" "They've been asking about you all day," Ruth Stoltzfus confirmed. "My grandson Peter has been practicing his English so he can teach you Pennsylvania Dutch words." The laughter that rippled through the congregation broke the last of the formal tension. Samuel raised the wooden cross once more, then carefully placed it in Tommy's small hands. "This was your grandmother Sarah's," he said gently. "She would want you to have it, to remember that love builds bridges instead of walls." Tommy held the cross carefully, understanding its importance, even if he couldn't yet grasp all its meanings. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will," Samuel replied. Then, addressing the full congregation, "All in favor of welcoming the Fisher family as our beloved guests and neighbors." The community vote token passed from hand to hand once more, but this time there was no hesitation, no pause for consideration. When it returned to Samuel, he smiled broadly. "Welcome home," he said simply. 3 months later, on a warm March morning when the first crocuses were pushing through the last patches of snow, Eli stood in his workshop putting the finishing touches on a special project. The piece before him was unlike anything he had ever crafted. A small wooden truck, painted red with careful attention to every detail, complete with movable wheels and a hinged tailgate that opened and closed with satisfying precision. It was Not the broken toy truck that Maren had pulled from the trash bin behind Miller's general store on that desperate Christmas Eve. That discarded piece of plastic had long since found its way to the community's recycling efforts. This was something entirely different, a symbol of transformation, of how broken things could become beautiful when touched by patient love and skilled hands. Tommy burst through the workshop door with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old who had spent the winter growing stronger and more confident. His cheeks were flushed from running, and his Pennsylvania Dutch, while still limited, was improving daily thanks to the patient tutoring of his new friends. "Gross Daddy," he called, using the German word for grandfather that had become as natural to him as breathing. "Mama says breakfast is ready, and she made the pancakes the way you taught her." Eli smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, marveling once again at how completely Tommy had adapted to their quiet rhythms of life. The child who had once searched through garbage for Christmas treasures now woke each morning to a world full of people who delighted in his presence and growth. "In a moment," Eli said, holding up the finished truck. "First, I have something for you." Tommy's eyes widened as he took in the beautiful craftsmanship of the wooden toy. Unlike the mass-produced plastic truck from that first night, this one bore the unmistakable marks of loving creation. The smooth finish that came from hours of careful sanding, the precise joints that would last for generations, the attention to detail that transformed a simple toy into a work of art. "For me?" Tommy whispered, afraid to believe such beauty could be his. "For you," Eli confirmed, placing the truck in the boy's eager hands. "From the grandfather who loves you more than all the wood in the forest." Tommy ran his small fingers over the smooth surface, exploring every carefully crafted detail. Then, without warning, he launched himself into Eli's arms with a fierceness that nearly knocked the older man off balance. "I love you too, Grosdadi," he said, his voice muffled against Eli's shoulder. "More than all the trucks in the world." They walked together toward the house, Tommy chattering about his plans for the new truck, while Eli listened with the patient attention that had become second nature to him. The farmhouse looked different now, more lived in, more loved. Maren's presence had brought a warmth that had been missing since Sarah's death, not replacing what had been lost, but adding something new and precious. In the kitchen, Maren stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. She wore a simple dress, in the style favored by the Amish women, though in deference to her unbaptized status, it was a soft blue rather than the traditional black or grey. Her hair was pulled back in a practical style that allowed her to work. Without distraction, the past 3 months had transformed her as completely as they had transformed Tommy. The desperate edge that had marked her features on that first night had been replaced by the serene confidence of someone who knew she was valued and loved. She had taken to community life with surprising ease, her skills with bookkeeping and correspondence making her invaluable to several of the local businesses. More importantly, she had found in the Amish emphasis on family and community the sense of belonging she had searched for all her life. She attended services regularly, asked thoughtful questions about faith and practice, and had begun studying Pennsylvania Dutch with the serious dedication of someone who intended to make this community a permanent home. "Look what Grosdadi made me," Tommy announced, holding up his new truck with pride. Maren turned from the stove, her face lighting up with the same wonder that had marked Tommy's reaction. "It's beautiful," she said softly, then looked at her father with eyes full of gratitude. "And love. You spoil him." "I have 40 years of spoiling to make up for," Eli replied, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "And 40 years of being a father to make up for, too." They shared breakfast together, the easy conversation of a family who had learned to treasure these simple moments of togetherness. Tommy told stories about his friendship with the Stoltzfus children. Maren shared news from the correspondence she had handled for the furniture cooperative, and Eli listened with the deep contentment of a man who had finally found the purpose he hadn't known he was missing. After breakfast, as they prepared for their respective days, Tommy to the one-room schoolhouse, where he was thriving under the patient instruction of teacher Mary Byler, Maren to her work with the community's business affairs, and Eli to his workshop, where orders for his furniture had increased dramatically since word spread about the quality of his craftsmanship. Eli paused at the window that overlooked Miller's general store, the same window where he had first spotted Maren searching through the trash bin on that bitter Christmas Eve. But now, instead of seeing desperation and loss, he saw possibility and hope. Children played in the street, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Adults moved with the unhurried pace of people whose lives had meaning and purpose. And in his own yard, Tommy was already playing with his new truck, making engine sounds. As he guided it through an elaborate course he had constructed from twigs and stones, Maren came to stand beside him at the window, following his gaze to their son. For that's what Tommy had become to Eli. Not just a grandson, but the son he had never had the chance to raise. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if she had sent that letter 40 years ago? Maren asked quietly. Eli considered the question seriously, as he considered all of Maren's thoughtful inquiries about their shared past. I think, he said finally, that God's timing is not always our timing, but it's always perfect. If Rebecca had told me then, I might have made different choices, but they wouldn't necessarily have been better choices. I might have left the community out of duty rather than choosing to stay out of faith. You might have grown up torn between two worlds instead of finding your own path to this one. He turned to smile at his daughter, still marveling at the miracle of her presence in his life. Perhaps we had to wait 40 years to be ready for each other. Outside, Tommy's laughter mixed with the sound of the wooden truck's wheels rolling across the porch boards, creating a symphony of childhood joy that filled the spaces that grief had once occupied in Eli's heart. Later that evening, as the family gathered for their simple supper, and Tommy said grace in his improving Pennsylvania Dutch, Eli reflected on the mysterious ways that love could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The Amish congregation had been enriched by welcoming these strangers who had become family, had discovered new ways to live out their faith through acts of radical hospitality, and somewhere, Eli was certain, Rebecca was smiling at the family. She had made possible through her courage to love, her wisdom to sacrifice, and her faith that love, true love, always finds a way to complete itself, even across the span of 40 years and the boundaries between different worlds. The wooden truck sat on Tommy's bedroom windowsill that night, bathed in moonlight, a testament to the truth that broken things could be made whole, that discarded dreams could be redeemed, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the deepest losses, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal their true purpose in the intricate tapestry of a life lived in faith and love.